The chapel doors hadn't finished swinging open when Rear Admiral Douglas Hartwell grabbed her wrist, not her shoulder, her wrist, like she was a child wandering into the wrong room. "This section," he said loud enough for 300 people to hear, "is reserved for military personnel and their families." Elise Navarro didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in her plain black dress while every head in the stone chapel turned toward her, including her mother's, including her brothers, and not one of them said a word in her defense. She was 31 years old. She had pulled men out of burning vehicles in places that don't appear on public maps. She had kept a soldier's heart beating with her bare hands for 6 minutes in the dark. And right now, the only sound in the room was the echo of her own humiliation. If this story already has you leaning forward, stay with me until the end. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The drive from Portland to Creston's Bay took 4 hours on a good day. On a January morning with ice patching the highway and a low sky the color of old pewter, it took Elise Navarro 5 hours and 40 minutes. Long enough for her coffee to go cold twice and for her to rehearse, then abandon every version of what she planned to say when she walked through the front door. She hadn't been back in 14 months. That wasn't unusual for her. The gaps between visits had been getting longer since she was 24. And nobody in her family pretended anymore that it was anything other than what it was. Distance, the kind that doesn't show up on a map. Her mother, Ruth, had stopped asking detailed questions years ago. Her brother Callum had stopped pretending to be curious even before that. What remained between them was the surface version of a family. Holiday calls, occasional texts, the performance of closeness without its actual weight. The town of Creston's Bay sat on the Oregon coast in a way that felt slightly accidental, like it had slid down the cliffs and settled there and simply never bothered to move. Population 4,200 on a generous count. One main road called Harbor Loop that curved along the waterfront and collected every significant building in town the way a drain collects water. The Immaculate Memorial Chapel sat at the northern end of Harbor Loop, a stone building that had been hosting funerals and military memorials for 60 years. Her father had walked past it 100 times. Now they were bringing him inside it. Sergeant First Class Raymond Navarro had died 11 days ago. Lung cancer, diagnosed 8 months before, that progressed faster than anyone anticipated. He was 63. He had done 2 tours in the Gulf, 1 in Afghanistan, and had spent the last decade of his career as a drill instructor at Fort Whitman before medical separation. He was not a soft man, but he had never been a cruel one. He had simply been a man who believed that silence meant strength, and had raised 2 children, one who learned that lesson, and one who learned to resent it. Elise had inherited the silence. Callum had inherited the resentment. She pulled off Highway 1 at the Creston Bay exit and felt the familiar compression in her chest. Not grief exactly, or not only grief, something more compound. The feeling of returning to a place that had already decided who you were before you walked back in. The service was scheduled for 11. She had arrived at 9:40. She had told herself the early arrival was practical. She needed to sign some paperwork at the funeral home, coordinate with the Veterans Affairs liaison about the flag ceremony, confirm the order of speakers. All of that was true. None of it was the full reason. The full reason was that she needed 20 minutes in the parking lot to sit with the steering wheel and make herself ready for whatever version of this day was coming. She got 9 minutes before her phone buzzed. "You're here. Callum." Not a greeting, an accusation formatted as a question. She typed back. "Just parked. Give me a few." The ellipsis appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again, then, "Mom needs you inside. She's been asking." Elise looked at the chapel's side entrance across the parking lot. 2 men in dress uniforms were carrying a folding table. A woman from the funeral home in a charcoal blazer was holding a clipboard and speaking into an earpiece. Everything organized, everything proceeding on a schedule that had been arranged without Elise's input, because she had not been reachable, officially at least, for most of the past 3 months. She got out of the car. The air coming off the water was sharp enough to make her eyes water, and she let it. She walked toward the side entrance with her hands in her coat pockets and her shoulders squared, not because she felt confident, but because that was the only posture she knew how to hold anymore. It was a learned thing, that posture, trained into muscle memory over years.
If you held yourself like you knew where you were going, most people assumed you did. Ruth Navarro was standing just inside the entrance hall, speaking quietly with a woman Elise didn't recognize. Civilian clothes, late 60s, probably a neighbor or a church acquaintance. Ruth looked up when Elise pushed open the door, and the expression that crossed her face was complicated. Relief? Yes. Something else underneath it that Elise had learned not to name. "You made it," Ruth said. "Of course I did." Elise embraced her mother carefully. Ruth was smaller than she remembered, or Elise kept forgetting how small her mother actually was underneath the size of her presence. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine." Ruth pulled back and looked at her daughter with the particular scrutiny of someone checking for evidence. "You look thin." "I'm fine, Mom." "Did you eat on the drive?" "I stopped in Lincoln City." Ruth made a sound that indicated this was inadequate, but that she was choosing not to pursue it. The woman beside her, who turned out to be a neighbor named Doris, who had been bringing casseroles for 2 weeks, murmured something sympathetic and excused herself. Ruth watched her go, then turned back to Elise with the expression that meant the surface portion of the conversation was over. "Callum is already inside," Ruth said. "He brought his work friends, 3 of them. I don't know why he needed to bring 3 of them to a funeral. Maybe he needed the support." Ruth looked at her with flat patience. "He's been here for a week. I'm the one who needed the support." This was the particular architecture of her family's complaints, layered so that the real grievance was always underneath the stated one. Ruth was not actually criticizing Callum for bringing friends. She was telling Elise, in the way she had always preferred to tell her things, that she had been alone and that Elise had not been here. "I came as soon as I could," Elise said. "Not defensively, just as a fact. I know you did." Ruth smoothed the front of her black dress with both hands. "Your father's old commander is here, Rear Admiral Hardwell. He flew in from Virginia. I didn't know he was coming. Neither did I until yesterday."
Apparently, he and your father were close for years. I never knew that. Ruth said it without quite managing to keep the edge out of her voice. Another person who had kept things from her, even her own husband. He's been very kind, but he runs things a certain way. Protocol. He asked me about the seating arrangement. Something moved in Elise's chest, quiet and quick, like a card being placed face down on a table. "What did you tell him?" she said. Ruth's eyes didn't quite meet hers. "I told him the front rows were for family and service members. He asked about you, and I didn't know what to say exactly. I told him you were family, and he said he'd manage the arrangement himself." Ruth picked up her small black clutch from the entrance table. "I'm sure it'll be fine." Elise said nothing. She was almost certain it would not be fine. She was right. The main chapel at Immaculate's Memorial was larger than it looked from the outside. High stone ceiling, pale winter light pushing through narrow windows, pews arranged in a long rectangular configuration with a wide center aisle. At the front, her father's flag-draped casket sat on a bier, and flanking it on both sides were the elements of a formal military memorial, floral arrangements in muted colors, a framed photograph of Raymond Navarro in his Class A uniform, a small table holding his service medals under glass. Elise took all of this in from the rear entrance in approximately 3 seconds, because she had been trained to read rooms quickly. She identified the civilian section, the military section, the VIP pew reserved for flag officers and senior NCOs, and the gap in the seating logic that was already forming a problem before she reached the 3rd row. Callum found her in the aisle before she got that far. He was 36, 5 years older than her, and he had their father's build. Wide-shouldered, solid, the kind of physical presence that filled a room without trying. He wore a well-cut charcoal suit and a tie their father would have approved of, and the expression he always wore around Elise, which was a blend of affection and condescension, calibrated too carefully to call out without sounding petty. "You got here," he said, which was apparently the family greeting for the day. "I got here." She let him hug her. Over his shoulder, she watched the back rows filling with people she half recognized.
Neighbors, veterans from the local post, a few of her father's drill instructor colleagues, still carrying themselves like they were on inspection. "How's the morning been?" "Long." Callum pulled back and looked at her with the same clinical attention their mother had used, though his version was less about affection and more about cataloging. "You look tired." "I drove 5 hours." "You could have flown." "I drove." She looked past him toward the front. "Is the Admiral already seated?" Something shifted in Callum's face, a tightening around the eyes. "He's up front. He's been organizing things." He paused, and in the pause she heard the thing he wasn't saying. "He asked about you." "What did you tell him?" Callum met her gaze directly. He had always been willing to say things to her face. She'd give him that. "I told him you worked at a hospital in Portland, that you'd left the service." A beat. Which is what we all thought. Which is what you all thought, she said. Elise, where does he have me seated? Another pause. He was talking about the civilian section, the east side, back half. She looked at her brother for a moment with an expression she kept very controlled. Then she said, "Okay," and turned toward the front of the chapel. She made it to the third pew from the front before Douglas Hartwell appeared. He came from the side aisle, a tall man, early 60s, silver-haired and full dress whites, with the broad stripe of a rear admiral on his sleeve. He had the kind of military bearing that was not performed but structural, the way some men carry their service in their actual skeleton. He moved with authority the way water moves downhill, not aggressively, just as the most natural thing in the world. He saw her when she reached the pew. His hand came out and closed around her wrist. Not her shoulder, her wrist. The touch was firm, proprietary, the kind of grip that communicated a category error. You are in the wrong place, and I am correcting it, without requiring the person doing it to raise their voice. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. The chapel was quiet enough that the first 2 rows heard everything perfectly. This section, Hartwell said, is reserved for military personnel and their families. Elise went very still. Around her heads turned. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing, the pressure shift of collective attention. 300 people or close to it, and in the time it took her heart to beat twice, most of them were watching. She could see
Mother in the second pew, rigid and unmoving, eyes on her clasped hands. She could see Callum 3 feet away, jaw set, doing the calculation she had watched him do all their lives, the calculation that weighed speaking up against the cost of speaking up, and found speaking up too expensive. She could see the retired colonel beside Hartwell nodding slightly, confirming the Admiral's read of the situation. Hartwell was still holding her wrist, not hard, just present. "Ma'am?" he said with the precise inflection of a man who believed he was being generous by offering an exit. "There are seats available in the civilian section. I can have someone show you." Someone like she was a guest who had wandered into the wrong event. The moment stretched. Elise Navarro had survived things that would not survive the retelling in any civilian context. She had done it by staying controlled, by not spending emotion she couldn't afford, by keeping her face exactly as informative as she chose to make it. Right now she chose to make it informative of nothing. She looked at Hartwell. She looked at her mother. She looked at Callum. Then she turned and walked toward the back of the chapel. Her heels on the stone floor made a sound that was the only sound in the room for 4 full seconds. She sat in the 7th row from the back. The seat smelled like cold stone and old wood, and someone's perfume from a service earlier in the week. She folded her hands in her lap and fixed her eyes on the casket at the front, and made her breathing even, because that was what she had, and that was what she did with it. So the service started, 11 minutes late. The chaplain was a young man who had known her father only through documentation and testimony, and he spoke carefully, the way people speak when they are trying to honor someone they never knew. He got some things right. Raymond's precision, his loyalty to his soldiers, his particular way of giving criticism that somehow managed to also be encouragement. He got some things slightly wrong, the timeline of Raymond's second tour, the name of his firebase. But nobody corrected him because that wasn't what you did. Elise sat in the 7th row and listened, and tried to locate her grief underneath all the other things that were crowding it. She had been to many memorials, military ones specifically, in better chapels than this, in worse chapels than this.
in rooms that were barely rooms, in open air with nothing but wind and dirt, and whatever ceremony they could construct from what was on hand. She had learned that grief was not one thing. It was a cluster of different pressures that showed up at different times. And right now, hers was layered over with something that she was carefully not calling humiliation, because humiliation was what you felt when you believed the other person's assessment of your value, and she had stopped doing that a long time ago. What she was feeling was more like exposure, not of her weakness, of her situation, the impossible geometry of it. 13 years of constructed silence, the cover maintained so completely that even the people who were supposed to love her had filled the space with their own stories about who she was, and she had not been permitted to correct them. And now she was sitting in the 7th row from the back of her own father's memorial, because an admiral who had never seen her file
had decided with total confidence what she was. The first speaker after the chaplain was a retired first sergeant named Obi Toiver, who had served with Raymond in the early 90s. He was 70, bald, built like a man who had once been made of something harder than he was now, and he told a story about Raymond that Elise had never heard. Something about a vehicle breakdown in the Saudi desert in 1991, and Raymond spending 4 hours in 117-degree heat, refusing to leave a piece of equipment behind because it was government property and he had signed for it. That was Ray, Toiver said. It didn't matter if the regulation made sense. He'd signed for it. It was his. He was going to account for every piece of it. Elise thought about that. Her father had taught her something similar, though never with words. He had taught it by example, by the way he carried his obligations with him everywhere, by the way his word was the same thing as his signature. She had not known when she was a child watching him that she was learning something she would carry for 13 years in a context he would never fully see. She also hadn't known until 11 days ago that he had known more than she thought. She found that out from the notification letter. The formal condolence correspondence from the Army that came through channels she was technically not supposed to receive in her current status, but had anyway because her CO had made a phone call and someone had made an exception.
Inside it, there was a separate note, handwritten on plain paper from a retired medic named Stu Falgout, who had served with her father, and who was apparently the only person in Raymond Navarro's life he had ever told the truth to. "He told me about you once," the note read, in the careful cursive of a man who had learned to write formally and never changed. Not the cover, the real thing. He said you were doing what soldiers do, carrying what needed to be carried so others didn't have to. He was proud. Don't let anyone tell you he wasn't. She had read that note in the parking lot of a 7-Eleven in Eugene at 2 in the morning and had pressed her forehead against the steering wheel for a while. Then she had driven the rest of the way. What the service ran an hour and 20 minutes. When the chaplain indicated the beginning of the final honor ceremony, the uniformed personnel in the front rows stood. The retired colonel, the 2 captains from the veterans post, the NCOs who had served with Raymond over the years. Hartwell stood massed in the practiced way of men accustomed to being watched. The flag was folded, 14 folds, precise and slow, each one tightening the triangle of blue and stars until it was the geometry of a salute. The sergeant who handled it had done this many times. You could see it in his hands, the absence of hesitation. He carried the folded flag to Ruth Navarro and knelt and presented it to her with the words that Elise could recite from memory, but still, even now, felt differently every time she heard them. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation. Ruth received it with both hands and pressed it to her chest, and her face finally broke the control she'd held all morning. Elise looked at the floor. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't feeling it. She was specifically a grief that was doing its work in the compressed interior space where most of her significant emotions now lived, but because she had gotten to a place in herself where the expression of emotion had become something she managed rather than something that managed her, and right now she needed to manage it. When she looked up, Hartwell was looking at her, not the appraising look from before, something different. His head was slightly tilted, the way someone's head tilts when they're trying to resolve a discrepancy, when the picture they're looking at doesn't match the frame around it. His phone, she noticed,
was visible in his left hand, face down, which meant it had buzzed, and he'd muted it rather than looking at it. She watched him look at her for 2 seconds. Then she looked back at the casket. Behind her, the rear chapel doors opened. She didn't turn around, but she heard them. The soft pneumatic sigh of well-maintained hinges, and then footsteps. More than one person. Military footsteps. Because there's a rhythm to the way people move when they've spent years marching. A cadence that becomes the default even when they're walking freely. She didn't turn around. In the front row, Hartwell's phone buzzed again. This time, he looked at it. She watched his face from across 40 feet of stone chapel, and what she saw there was not something she had expected. Not confusion, not irritation at the interruption, but something that moved through his expression, the way weather moves through a sky, fast, significant, changing everything about the atmosphere. He looked at the phone. He looked at her. The colonel beside him leaned in, and Hartwell said something in his ear that made the colonel go very still. Ruth had stopped crying. She was watching the front, watching Hartwell, the folded flag still pressed to her chest. Callum turned in his pew and looked toward the back of the chapel, where the footsteps had stopped. Elise finally turned. There were two of them, officers in dress uniform, standing at the rear entrance with the particular stillness of people waiting for the right moment. Not Hartwell's people. Their shoulder boards were different. Their bearing was the particular bearing of people who worked in offices that didn't have office directories. One of them was looking directly at her. And then Hartwell was standing up, not in the slow, deliberate way of a man rising for ceremony, in the quick, reactive way of a man who has just understood something and cannot stay sitting with the weight of it. He came down the center aisle. 300 people watched him. He stopped in front of the 7th row from the back. He stopped in front of Elise Navarro, and the rear admiral in his full-dress whites, with his service record and his confidence and his absolute certainty from 20 minutes ago about who belonged in which section of a chapel. He snapped his right hand to his temple in a salute that was not ceremonial. That was not the salute you give in a formal moment because protocol requires it. It was the other kind, the kind that means I understand now what you are, and I am sorry for what I did not understand before. "Ma'am," Hartwell said, and his voice this time had none of the authority in it, just the word stripped to its actual meaning. Around the chapel in ones and twos, and then in a wave, the service members rose to their feet. Her mother's head came up slowly. Callum's mouth was open. Elise Navarro sat in the 7th row from the back of her father's memorial and looked at the admiral standing in front of her, and she kept her face entirely controlled, because she had been keeping her face controlled for 13 years, and she was not going to stop now, and because what she was feeling in that moment was not triumph, like it was something older and more complicated than that, something that didn't have a
simple name. She stood. "Admiral," she said, and that was all. But behind Hartwell, one of the two officers from the rear entrance reached into his dress coat and removed a folded document. Not a letter, something more formal, with a seal on the outer fold that caught the pale winter light through the narrow windows, and he held it out to her, and the chapel was so quiet you could hear the water. The document sat in her hands for 3 seconds before she understood what she was holding. Not orders, not accommodation. The outer fold carried a seal she recognized, not because it was famous, but because she had seen it exactly 4 times in her career, each time in a context that required her to act quickly and say nothing about it afterward. The kind of seal that meant, this conversation is happening at a level most people don't have clearance to know exists. She looked at the officer who had handed it to her. He was mid-30s, lean, with the blank professional courtesy of someone whose job required him to be invisible. His name tag read Dorsey. She didn't know him, but he held himself in a way that told her exactly which office he worked out of, the same way a certain handshake tells you something about the person before they've said a word. "You don't need to open it here," Dorsey said quietly, "but the colonel wanted you to have it today." She folded it once more and put it in her coat pocket. Hartwell was still standing in the aisle. He had lowered his salute, but his posture hadn't recovered its earlier confidence, and she suspected it wasn't going to. Not today. The men who had served with her father were still standing, both not in formation, just on their feet, which was a different and more honest thing than a formal ceremony. It was the kind of standing that happens when people don't know what else to do with themselves, when the situation has moved faster than their understanding of it. Ruth was watching from the second pew with an expression Elise couldn't fully read at this distance, something that lived between confusion and a reckoning she wasn't ready to start having yet. Callum hadn't sat back down. Perhaps, the chaplain said carefully from the pulpit, we might take a brief moment before the recessional. Nobody disagreed with that. Elise moved out of the pew and into the side aisle. She didn't look at Hartwell as she passed him, not out of anger. She was past
that already, had put it somewhere she'd deal with later, but because looking at him right now would invite a conversation she wasn't equipped to have. In front of 300 people, she needed a door and 4 minutes and something that wasn't this room. She found a side corridor off the main nave, a narrow stone hallway that smelled like old candles and cleaning fluid. And she stood there with her back against the wall and her hand pressed flat against the folded document in her coat pocket, and let herself breathe for the first time since the morning. The footsteps behind her were Dorsey's. She'd expected that. "How much does the Admiral know?" she said without turning. "Enough," Dorsey said. "The base commander at Whitman recognized your name on the chapel register. He flagged it up. The Admiral's office was notified 20 minutes ago." 20 minutes. She calculated backward, during the flag folding, while she was sitting in the 7th row looking at the floor. Who made the call? Captain Valand. He served with your father. He apparently knew enough to know that something wasn't adding up. A pause. He also knew enough to make the call go to the right place. Elise thought about Valand. She'd never met him, but the name had come up once in a briefing sidebar, the kind of footnote that you absorbed and filed away without knowing you'd need it. People like that existed throughout the military infrastructure, men and women who had been around long enough to recognize the shape of a classified situation, even without being told what was inside it. The document, she said. It's a formal service acknowledgement, redacted in the appropriate places but sufficient. Dorsey's voice stayed level. He was good at his job. The colonel thought you should have something on paper given the circumstances. Given the circumstances. That was a careful way to say given that a flag officer just grabbed your wrist in front of your father's casket and publicly ordered you to the back of the room like a civilian who'd walked into the wrong building. The Admiral wants to speak with you, Dorsey added. He can wait. A beat. Yes, ma'am. She stood in the stone corridor for another minute. She could hear the murmur of the chapel reassembling itself, the soft percussion of 300 people shifting in wooden pews, the chaplain's voice resuming its careful cadence, the low register of organ music starting up from somewhere.
The service was continuing. Life had that habit. It continued even when you were standing in a side corridor with your hand on your coat pocket, trying to figure out how to walk back into a room that had just changed shape. She walked back in. The recessional moved the casket out through the main doors and down the chapel steps to the waiting hearse, and the assembled attendees followed in the loose processional order of grief. Family first, then veterans, then the civilians who had come to show respect. Elise walked with her mother and Callum behind the casket, which was where she was supposed to be, where she had always been supposed to be. And if anyone in the crowd found the geometry of this changed from 20 minutes earlier, they were quiet about it. Hartwell fell in to step beside her on the chapel steps. She let him. "I owe you an apology," he said. Not a preamble, just the sentence. Delivered the way certain men deliver difficult things, direct, without the performance of difficulty. "You do," she said. He accepted that without flinching. She gave him credit for it. "I acted on assumption. That was a failure of judgment." It was. "I'd like to, Admiral." She kept walking, kept her voice low. "Not today. I mean that without hostility, but not today." He was quiet for a moment, then understood. He peeled off at the bottom of the steps, rejoining his aide and the retired colonel, and Elise kept walking behind her father's casket to the car that would take them to the cemetery, and she did not look back. Callan appeared at her left elbow at the car door. He said, "What was that document?" "Service. Acknowledgement." "Acknowledgement of what?" She looked at her brother in the pale January light, with his good suit and his careful face. He looked older than she usually thought of him, tired, in the particular way of a man who had been in charge of something for a week. Logistics, emotion, their mother's needs, the particular burden of being the one who showed up, and who was now encountering the fact that the story he'd been telling himself about his family wasn't quite the shape he thought it was. "I'll explain later," she said. "Elise." "Callum." She opened the car door. "I'll explain later. Can we get Dad in the ground first?" He shut his mouth. He got in the car. Creston Bay's military cemetery was on a bluff above the town, a half-mile east of the chapel, accessible by a 2-lane road that curved up through low coastal scrub and flattened out onto a plateau that in summer was probably remarkable. Open sky, the Pacific visible to the west, the kind of view that made death feel less like a full stop and more like a transition. In January it was cold and gray, and the wind off the ocean was the kind that found every gap in your clothing without asking, and the assembled mourners stood at the graveside with their collars up, and their faces doing what faces do when the cold is competing with the grief. The graveside ceremony was shorter, 20 minutes, military precision. Another chaplain prayer and a rifle volley that cracked across the bluff and startled a cluster of gulls off a nearby fence. The echo of the shots took a long time to die against the sky. Ruth stood with the flag in her arms. Elise stood beside her. The 2 officers from the chapel, Dorsey and his partner, who had been introduced only as Major Sills, stood at a respectful distance near the tree line. Not intrusively, just present, the way that certain official presences are present, visible without demanding acknowledgement. Callum noticed them. She could tell by the way his eyes moved to them and away twice in the span of 3 minutes. He was trying to fit them into his existing framework, and the existing framework wasn't working anymore,
and she could see him starting to build a new one. She knew that look. She had watched him do her whole life. Callum assembled information like he assembled furniture, with the manual in hand and in a deep suspicion of pieces that didn't match the diagram. Right now, his diagram had several unaccounted-for pieces. After the graveside ceremony, when the casket had been lowered and the flowers placed, and the official military portion of the mourning concluded, people began the slow social redistribution that happens at every funeral. Small groups forming and dissolving, the particular careful conversations of people who share grief but not much else. Ruth was surrounded by neighbors and churchwomen, and the retired colonel's wife, who had the useful quality of managing other people's emotions without appearing to do so. Elise found Stu Falgu near the parking lot. She had recognized him from a photograph, 73, compact with a white mustache and the rolling walk of a man who'd done a lot of miles on difficult terrain. He was standing alone, which she suspected was deliberate. He had the
look of a man who had come to pay his respects and had planned to do it without getting tangled in the social portion. "Mr. Falgout," she said. He turned and looked at her with the directness of someone who had been expecting her. "You're Ray's daughter, the younger one. Elise, I know who you are." He said it without edge, just fact. "Your dad talked about you. I got your letter." He nodded once, a small motion like he was checking a box. "I wasn't sure if it would reach you, wasn't sure if you were even in country. I got it in Eugene." She paused. "In a 7-Eleven parking lot." Something moved in his expression, not amusement exactly, but recognition, the particular expression of someone who has also had significant moments in undignified locations. "Did you eat anything?" "I had a hot dog." He made a sound that was half laugh, half something more complicated. "Your dad would have something to say about that." "He would." She looked at him steadily. He knew the real thing, not the story. He knew enough. Falgout pulled his coat tighter against the wind. "I don't know all the details." He wouldn't give them, but he knew more than people thought he knew. Ray was better at reading situations than he let on. He figured out something was off about the story years ago. He just couldn't get anyone to confirm it. He paused. "Until I did." She went still. "How did you get confirmation?" Falgout looked at her with an expression that carried a long history in it. "I was in the army a long time. I know people who know people. I didn't get details. I got enough to tell a father that his daughter wasn't what people were saying she was." He looked toward the grave. He cried. "Ray?" I never saw him cry before in 30 years. He turned away so I wouldn't see it, but I did. Elise looked at the ground. She stood with that for a moment. Her father alone in a room with Stu Falgout, turning away so no one would see his face. "Thank you," she said. It was inadequate and she knew it, and she said it anyway because it was what she had. "Don't thank me," Falgout said. "Thank him. He carried that pride for a long time without anywhere to put it." She found her mother at the reception. The Navarros didn't have a house large enough to hold the post-funeral gathering, so it was held at the Creston Bay Veterans Post Hall, a low building on Harbor Loop that smelled like old coffee and industrial carpet, and the particular combination of things that accumulates in buildings used for
decades by people doing the business of remembrance. Someone had put out sandwiches and a coffee urn and plates of cookies that nobody was really eating. And the assembled mourners moved through the space in the slow, directionless way of people who have completed an obligation and are not quite ready to leave. Ruth was in a chair near the far wall, with a cup of tea going cold in her hands. Elise sat down beside her. They sat in silence for a full minute. At their family's particular level of functional dysfunction, silence had always been the native language. It had just meant different things depending on who was doing it. "The people at the cemetery," Ruth said finally. "The 2 men in uniform. Who were they?" "They came to deliver something to me." "From where?" "From my command." Ruth turned her head slowly. "Your command." She said the word the way someone says a word they've just learned, testing its weight. "You have a command?" "I have a chain of command." "Elise." Her mother's voice was steady, but only just. "I need you to talk to me like I'm a person and not a security clearance." That landed. Elise felt it. "I'm still in the reserves," she said carefully. "I've been in a specialized medical program. I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you that I didn't fail out. I didn't quit. I didn't settle. Everything you were told, everything I let you believe, was what I was supposed to let you believe." Ruth was quiet for a long time, long enough that the woman 3 chairs down finished her cookie and left.
and someone refilled the coffee urn, and a veteran on the other side of the room began telling a story about Raymond that involved a jeep and a misdirected supply shipment in Kandahar. 13 years, Ruth said. Yes. You let me introduce you to people as... She stopped. I told people you were a hospital nurse. I said it with that tone. Another stop. You know which tone I mean. Elise knew which tone she meant. I know, Elise said. And you couldn't tell me? No. Not even not a word. Not a hint. No. Ruth set her tea down on a nearby table. It was a controlled motion, but barely. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she pressed them flat against her thighs. I said things, she said quietly, to your face, about how you'd given up, about the job, about... She stopped again. The list was too long, apparently. It ran out of road before it ran out of items. Mom, don't. Ruth's voice went sharp and then immediately receded. I'm not
looking for absolution. I need to sit with this, okay? Because I was wrong about everything, and I said those things in front of your father. He knew. I said he figured it out. Ruth turned to look at her sharply. Stu Faugout told me. He knew years ago. He was proud. She kept her voice even. He just couldn't say so. The tears that had been managing themselves all morning finally stopped. Managing. Ruth Navarro put her hand over her mouth and looked at the wall and cried in the quiet, controlled way of a woman who had spent 60 years not making a scene, which meant the grief came out sideways, in small increments, pressed through a very narrow opening. Elise put her hand over her mother's. They sat like that for a while. Callum found her an hour later in the parking lot. She'd stepped outside to get away from the noise and to call her CO. A brief, coded check-in. Nothing significant, just the regular accounting that her situation required, even on days like this. She was leaning against her car when Callum came out the side door, with his jacket open despite the cold, which was something he did when he was agitated. He stopped a few feet away. She put her phone in her pocket. I made some calls, he said. Did you? I called Whitman Base Administration. I said I was trying to get information about my sister's service record. He paused. They told me they couldn't confirm or deny any service record for the name I provided. And then they said something I wasn't expecting. What did they say? They said my call was going to be logged and that someone might be in touch with me. His jaw was tight. And then they said, have a good day, and hung up. She looked at him without expression. Who are you? He said, not accusatory, genuinely uncertain. The particular uncertainty of someone who has been looking at something for 30 years and just discovered the entire orientation was wrong. I'm your sister Elise. I'm a medical officer, reserve status, attached to a program I'm not able to discuss in detail. Everything else you need to know is either in that acknowledgement document or it's not available. She held his gaze. That's the whole answer I can give you. Callum put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the parking lot, at the low gray sky, at the tree line. He looked at the building they both just come out of. He looked at his sister. I called you a nurse like it was a punchline, he said. Every Christmas, that whole. I did the voice. He stopped.
You know the voice. I mean, she knew the voice he meant. I'm not going to tell you it didn't land, she said, because it did. He absorbed that. I couldn't figure out why you never came back to defend yourself. I thought it was because you couldn't. A pause. It was because you weren't allowed to. Partly and partly. She considered him for a moment, her brother, who was not a bad person, who had never been a bad person, who had simply filled the space she'd left empty with the most convenient narrative available and never questioned it, because questioning it would have required admitting it was a narrative rather than a fact. Partly because nobody was asking, she said. That one hit him. She could see it go in. He didn't say anything for a moment. The wind moved through the parking lot, and somewhere on Harbor Loop, a truck's brakes complained on the curve. Hartwell came to find you, Callum said. He was looking for you inside. He's been asking the Veterans Post liaison where you went. I know. He looked... Callum searched for the word. He looked like a man waiting for a firing squad he'd scheduled himself. Something in Elise's chest moved in a way that was almost amusement, but not quite. Tell him I'll find him before I leave. I'm not ready yet. Callum nodded. He started back toward the door, then stopped. Elise. She waited. I don't know how to... He stopped,
tried again. I don't know the right thing to say. I know there's one. I know I owe you one. I just... He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face since they were kids, before the family had taught both of them that vulnerability was an inconvenience. I don't know where to start. You don't have to start today, she said. When? When you know what you want to say. He went back inside. Elise stayed in the parking lot for another 10 minutes, her back against her car, looking at the narrow strip of Pacific visible between the rooftops at the end of the lot, cold and gray and moving, always moving. Her phone buzzed. Not her personal phone, her other one, the one that had a number known to exactly 11 people in the world, and none of them were her family. She looked at the screen. A single line of text, no sender name, just a code sequence she recognized as the prefix for her forward operating contact, followed by 6 words. Assignment moved up. Debrief. Thursday. Bucharest. She stared at the message for a long moment. She had 4 days. 4 days in Creston Bay with her mother and her brother and the complicated wreckage of 13 years of silence. And then she would be on a plane going somewhere that didn't share a time zone with any of this. She put the phone away. Inside the Veterans Post Hall, through the thin wall, she could hear voices. The particular
cadence of people finishing a gathering, the sounds of obligation completing itself. She heard her mother's voice, controlled again, now thanking someone. She heard Calumny's lower register explaining something to one of his friends, and beneath all of it, just barely audible through the wall, she heard Stu Falgout's voice telling someone about Raymond, the real Raymond, the one she had known and the one she was still learning. And she stood in the cold parking lot and let herself have 3 more minutes of that before she went back in. 3 minutes wasn't enough. It never was. She went back in anyway. Shab. She found Hartwell near the coffee urn. He saw her coming and put his cup down and straightened. Not to attention, not the formal military reflex, but the straightening of a man who knows he needs to stand up for what's coming. I'll be brief, she said. Take whatever time you need. I don't want you to feel like this was dealt with properly, because you saluted, she said. I don't want a formal apology in writing. I don't want a report filed. I want you to know that what you did this morning caused harm to my family during a moment when they were already at maximum capacity, and that the assumption behind it, that I couldn't possibly belong in that section of that room, was the assumption of someone who decided before checking. You teach others how to treat information. Today you didn't treat it well. Hartwell looked at her steadily. His face was not comfortable, but it was present. You're right. I know I am. Is there something I can do? She considered that. My father served this country for 22 years, she said. Make sure that means something in the way you do your job. Not as a favor to me, as a matter of practice. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. I will, he said. And she believed him. Not because the moment required her to believe him, but because she had spent 13 years learning to read the difference between men who said things and men who meant them, and he was in the second category. He was a man who had made a significant error and was going to carry it. The carrying would change something. It usually did with men like him. She nodded once and left him at the coffee urn. On the other side of the room, Major Sills caught her eye and gave a small professional nod. She returned it. She had until Thursday. She thought about her mother's hands shaking against her thighs. She thought about Callum's face in the parking lot, searching for where's he hadn't found yet. She thought about Stu Falgout saying he turned away so I wouldn't see it. She had 4 days. She was going to have to do 13 years of work in 4 days, and she wasn't sure it was possible. And she was going to try anyway. And then she was going to Bucharest. She picked up a cup of coffee from the urn and found a chair near her mother and sat down. Dorsey appeared beside her elbow at a quiet moment, a folder in his hands. One more thing, he said. She looked up. We found something in your father's personal effects from the hospital, addressed to you. Command held it pending today. He set the folder on the table beside her coffee cup. It was there when he was admitted 8 months ago. He wrote it early. She looked at the folder. She didn't open it. Not yet. Her mother was 3 feet away and starting to turn toward her with the beginning of a question. And the Veterans Post Hall was still full of people finishing their sandwiches and their grief. And the window behind her showed the last pale light of January going gray over Creston Bay. She put her hand on the folder. And that was when Dorsey's always
People, the sandwiches, the coffee urn, her mother turning fully toward her now with a question beginning to form on her face. 300 people had been in that chapel. She had 4 days, and somewhere between the chapel doors and this moment, someone in that room had decided that what they'd seen today was worth photographing and sharing. And that decision had just made the next 4 days, all of her next 4 days, entirely different from anything she'd planned. She stood up from the chair in one motion. "Where is it being shared?" she said. 3 platforms so far. The photograph has the seal and your name in the upper third. The program line at the bottom reads, Dorsey lowered his voice further. It reads, Operational Medical Intelligence, Classification Tier Redacted, but the structure of the designation is visible enough that anyone who knows what they're looking for will know what they're looking at. Elise processed that in approximately 2 seconds. Operational medical intelligence wasn't a phrase that appeared in public military literature. It existed in the way that certain infrastructure exists, functional, necessary, and entirely dependent on not being named. The moment it was named in a searchable context, it became a thread, and threads got pulled. "I need a phone," she said, "not mine." Dorsey handed her his without asking why. She already knew why. Her personal devices weren't rated for what she needed to say, and her secondary phone wasn't the right channel for a lateral contact. She dialed from memory, a number she'd never saved anywhere, and it picked up on the second ring. "It's Navarro," she said. "I have a document exposure situation. Creston Bay, Oregon. Civilian photograph. 3 platforms. Name and program structure visible. I need a content flag and a source trace on the image metadata." A pause on the other end. She added, "I'm at a family funeral. I have 4 days. I need this managed before it compounds." The voice on the other end said 3 words and disconnected. She handed the phone back to Dorsey. Her mother was fully watching her now, the question on her face no longer beginning but fully formed and waiting. Elise looked at her and made the smallest possible head motion. Not now. And Ruth, who had spent 60 years learning to read her husband's silences, read her daughter's correctly and looked away. "How long for the trace?"
She asked Dorsey. "Metadata analysis, maybe 2 hours. Platform flags faster. The image is still propagating though, so the window, I know what the window is." She picked up her coffee, which was cold, and drank it anyway because her hands needed something to do. "Is there a quiet room in this building?" "There's an office in the back. The post liaison offered it. Tell him I need it for 20 minutes. The office was small and overheated and smelled like old paper and a plug-in air freshener that had been working too hard for too long. There was a desk with a computer that had no place in this situation, and 2 chairs, and a window that looked at a concrete wall. Elise stood at the window, with Dorsey behind her and Major Sills in the doorway, and worked through what she actually knew. The photograph was taken in the chapel. The document had been out of her hands for approximately 40 seconds before she'd put it in her pocket. The transfer from Dorsey to her in the chapel aisle after Hartwell's salute. 40 seconds in which she had been standing in public with 300 people watching. The chapel had been full of active and retired military personnel, veterans' families, civilian neighbors. Anyone with a phone and quick reflexes could have captured it. The problem wasn't just the photograph. The problem was the chain of inference it enabled. Elise Navarro, identified by name on a document, carrying a classified program designation, attending a military memorial in Creston Bay, Oregon. That was a set of coordinates, false biographical, geographical, institutional, that didn't need to be fully decoded to be damaging. It needed only to be seen by the right person, or the wrong one. "The Bucharest assignment," she said. "Command is aware." Sill said, "They're assessing. They're assessing whether to pull it. They're assessing the exposure level." She turned from the window. "If the metadata traces back to someone in that chapel, what's the protocol?" Sills and Dorsey exchanged a look that lasted less than a second. "Depends on who it is," Sill said. "Civilian. Handled through legal channels. Platform removal. Possible federal inquiry, depending on intent. Military?" This time the pause was longer. "Then it's a different conversation." She had been in the military long enough to know what a different conversation meant. It meant the kind of meeting that happened in rooms without windows, where
The words used were precise, and the consequences were structural, and nobody raised their voice because nobody needed to. "Give me the 2 hours," she said. "I'll be with my family. Come find me when you have something." They left her alone in the overheated office for 2 minutes, which was what she'd wanted. She stood at the desk and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at nothing in particular, and let herself feel briefly and completely how much she did not want any of this to be the day she was having. Her father was in the ground. Her mother's hands had been shaking. Her brother was standing in a parking lot, trying to find words he didn't have yet. And she was in a back office, managing a document exposure, with 4 days on the clock before a flight to Bucharest. This was the shape of her life. It had always been the shape of her life. She had chosen it with full knowledge of its dimensions, and she had not regretted it, mostly, and she was not going to regret it right now. She went back out to her family. The gathering thinned over the next hour. People finished their coffee and their obligations and moved toward the door in ones and twos, pressing Ruth's hands and saying the things people say, most of which were true enough. Stu Fogout left quietly, without looking for Elise a second time, which she appreciated. He had already said the thing that needed saying. Callum's work friends left at 2. Callum stayed. At 2:30, Ruth asked Callum to take the flower arrangements back to the house, and in the 10 minutes he was carrying things to his car, Ruth turned to Elise on the folding chair beside her and said, "Open it." Elise looked at her. "The folder," Ruth said, "from your father. Open it." "Mom, I've been watching you not open it for 2 hours. Open it." The hall was nearly empty now. The post liaison was stacking chairs at the far end. The overheated office was behind a closed door. Outside, Harbor Loop was doing its ordinary afternoon business, indifferent to everything. Elise picked up the folder. The paper inside was her father's handwriting, which was the particular handwriting of a man who had learned to write in a military context. Neat, pressured, each letter formed with intention. He had written it on plain white paper. No
Alone with a piece of paper, saying what he should have said out loud. "Elise, I know I'm not supposed to know. I know that's the whole point. You not being able to tell me, me not being able to ask. I figured it out anyway. Maybe you knew I would. You got that from me, the figuring out part. Even if you got the quiet from somewhere I can't account for. I owe you an apology that I'm only putting on paper because I'm running out of time to say it in a way that doesn't come out sideways. I let your mother and your brother believe a story that I knew wasn't true for at least 5 years. I told myself I was respecting the situation. I think I was also a coward about it. That's harder to admit. What you do takes more than what I did. I want you to know I understand that, even if I never said so. Even if everything and how we raised you suggested otherwise, you carried more than we knew, and you carried it with honor. Come home when you can. The porch light is on, Dad." She read it twice, then she folded it along the same creases and put it back in the folder and set the folder on the table. Her mother was watching her. "Good," Ruth said. The word was inadequate, and Ruth knew it was inadequate, and she said it anyway because she needed to hear something. "Yeah," Elise said. "Good." Ruth reached over and covered her daughter's hand with hers, and they sat like that while the post liaison finished stacking chairs and the afternoon light went the color of pewter against the windows. Dorsey found her at 3:15. One look at his face told her the 2 hours hadn't produced what they'd hoped for, not because there was no trace, because the trace had produced something nobody had been expecting. "The image metadata," he said, keeping his voice below the ambient noise of the now nearly empty room. "We have a device ID and a partial location timestamp," and he held her gaze. "The device is registered to a retired senior NCO, Sergeant Major Gerald Prine. He served with your father at Fort Whitman. He was at the memorial today. We have him on the chapel register." She went very still. "Prime, you know him?" "I know the name." She said it carefully. Her father had mentioned Prime twice in the years before the cover story began, not warmly, the kind of mention that communicates a boundary without explaining why the boundary is there. "What's his current status?" "Retired, but he's been doing contractor work, private military consulting." Dorsey paused. "The
Firm he's contracted to has a flag in our system." She looked at him. "It's a firm with connections to a competing operational interest," Dorsey said. The phrasing was precise and deliberate. Competing operational interest was the language used when the flag in the system meant something beyond standard private sector concerns. It meant the firm had appeared in context that suggested alignment with entities whose interests ran counter to the program she was attached to. It didn't mean Prime was a knowing actor. It didn't mean he wasn't. "Where is he now, Bun?" she said. "He left the reception 20 minutes ago. He's still in Creston Bay. His rental car hasn't moved. It's parked on Harbor Loop." Dorsey's voice stayed level. 3 blocks from here. She thought about the folder in her hands, about her mother in the chair beside her, about Thursday and Bucharest, and the assignment that was currently being assessed by people in a room she couldn't see. "Is he alone?" she said. "We think so. We're still confirming." She looked at the window at the gray afternoon outside. "You said a competing operational interest. How current is the flag?" "Updated 11 weeks ago." 11 weeks. The same window she'd been forward deployed. The same window she'd been officially absent from her reserve status, functionally invisible to anyone checking for her through normal channels. Someone with access to a military consulting firm with the right connections could have spent 11 weeks building a picture of her program without ever finding her name.
And then today, in a stone chapel on the Oregon coast, her name had appeared on a sealed document in public, handled by 2 officers anyone could see were not attached to a standard unit, and Gerald Prine had taken a photograph. Maybe because he was an old soldier who'd done something thoughtless at a funeral without understanding the implications, or maybe not. "I need to talk to him," she said. Dorsey's expression shifted slightly. "That's not... I know what it's not. I need to talk to him." She stood up. "Not officially. Not with you standing next to me. Just me and a retired sergeant major who served with my father at a memorial gathering having a conversation. Elise, if he's a knowing actor, me walking up to him tells us something we need to know. If he's not, it's a conversation at a funeral." She looked at Dorsey steadily. "Either way, I need to know which one it is before I get on a plane Thursday." Dorsey looked
At her for a long moment. He was a man who followed protocol, and she was asking him to not follow it, and they both understood the precise nature of what she was asking. 20 minutes, he said. "I'll have eyes on the car. Don't have eyes on me." A pause. 15 minutes, he said. "Then I'm coming in regardless." She took her coat from the back of the chair. She picked up the folder with her father's letter and put it in her back. And she told her mother she needed to step out for a few minutes and that she'd be back before dinner. She walked out onto Harbor Loop. The light was thin and flat, and the water at the end of the street was dark. She could see the rental car from 40 feet away, a gray sedan parked in front of a closed souvenir shop. Engine off, a shape visible in the driver's seat. He was still there. She walked toward it. She was 12 feet away when Gerald Prine looked up from his phone and saw her coming. And the expression that crossed his face in that unguarded moment before he had time to arrange it into something else was not the expression of a man who had done something thoughtless at a funeral. It was the expression of a man who had been waiting. She stopped 6 feet from the car, close enough to see his face clearly through the glass, far enough that she had options if she needed them. Though she told herself she wouldn't need them, because this was a public street in a small coastal town, and Gerald Prine was 67 years old and retired. And whatever he was, she could handle whatever he was. She knocked on the passenger window with 2 knuckles. He unlocked the door. She got in. The car smelled like fast food and old coffee, and the particular staleness of a rental that had been driven for several days. Prine was a big man, going soft in the way that certain soldiers go soft after retirement, the muscle still there underneath, but losing its argument with time. Silver crew cut, heavy jaw, the kind of face that had probably read as imposing for 30 years, and now just read as tired. He was holding his phone face down against his thigh. They looked at each other. "You know who I am," she said. "Not a question. I know who you are." His voice was a low rasp, mid-Atlantic accent worn smooth by decades away from wherever he'd started. "You look like your father. People say that. Ray was a good man. He was." She let a beat pass. "You were waiting." Prine looked through the windshield at Harbor Loop. A pickup truck went by. Someone walked a dog on the opposite sidewalk. The ordinary afternoon continued its ordinary business around the car. "I figured you'd come find me," he said. "Or someone would. Why did you take the photograph?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone buying time. The quiet of someone who has prepared an answer and is deciding how much of it to use. "I recognized the seal," he said. "I wasn't supposed to, but I did. And I didn't know what you were doing there. Why those 2 officers were there. I didn't know what was happening. So you photographed a classified document. I photographed what I saw and shared it." Another pause. That was a mistake. Was it? He turned and looked at her directly. His eyes were the flat, steady gray of someone who had spent a career meaning what he said, or who had spent a career appearing to mean what he said, which was a different thing. She was still calibrating. "I made a call to someone when I got to the parking lot. I told them what I'd seen. They asked me to send the photograph." He stopped. "That part I should not have done." She waited. "The person I called,"
he said, and then he stopped again, and she could see him working through something that had the texture of genuine difficulty, not performance, not deflection, but the actual friction of a man who had done a thing and was trying to decide how to hold it. They told me it was routine, that there were concerns about the program you were attached to, that the photograph would be used to verify something internally, and that would be the end of it. Who told you that? He said a name. She didn't recognize it, which told her something. She would have recognized a name that belonged to any legitimate military or intelligence structure she'd ever interfaced with. The name, he said, was clean and unfamiliar in the specific way of a name that had been constructed to sound like it belonged somewhere. There, it didn't. That's not a name in any system I know, she said. Prime looked at her steadily. No, he said, I'm starting to think it's not. The car was very quiet. Outside, the dog walker had turned the corner, and the pickup truck was gone, and Harbor Loop had the specific emptiness of a small town in January at 3 in the afternoon. How long have you been with the firm? She said. Something moved through his expression, recognition that she already knew that the approach she'd taken hadn't been casual but constructed, and that he was 3 moves behind. 8 months, he said. Who recruited you? A guy I knew from Whitman. He said it was legitimate consulting, force structure analysis, nothing classified, but it moved. It moved. He said it flatly, without the inflection of someone surprised, more like someone confirming a thing they'd suspected was coming, and now that it had come, felt something between relief and dread. It moved slowly. Small asks, contacts I had, things I knew. Nothing that felt like a line until I was already across it. She understood that mechanism. She had been trained to understand it, because it was the mechanism most commonly used on exactly the kind of person Prime was.
Loyal, experienced, financially stretched in retirement with access that looked modest until it was mapped against what someone else was building. What did they want with my program? She said. Prime put his hand over his face briefly, rubbed it, put it down. They wanted to know if it was running a particular route. Eastern European Medical Corridor, Bucharest, Chisinau, Odessa Junction. They wanted to know if the program had assets at those points. She kept her face controlled. The Bucharest assignment, 11 weeks of her absence, a photograph taken at her father's memorial. The shape of it was assembling in front of her with the horrible clarity of a pattern becoming visible, each piece individually explicable, collectively unambiguous. Someone had been trying to map her program's operational geography, and she had just confirmed, by existing at this memorial with those officers in that document, that she was the piece that connected the dots. Did you give them names? She said. No, he said it immediately. I haven't given them names. I swear to you. Don't swear to me, she said. Just answer. No names? No specific locations. I told them I'd seen the
venue or through someone inside the Veterans Post Administration. Either way, it meant the operation against her program was not improvised. It had been in place before today, possibly before her father's death was even public. She forwarded the entire thread to Dorsey's number from memory. Then she held the phone. The name Marcus, she said. Last contact location from this thread. Prine hesitated. Portland, he told me. He said he was based out of Portland. She handed the phone back. When he contacts you again, you don't respond. You tell me. You have Dorsey's number now. It came through on your thread. She opened the car door. You should know that what you did today is going to have a formal review. Whether it goes further than that depends on what the trace finds and what you do next. I understand. He said it without defense. The particular flat acceptance of a man who had made a calculation, watched it fail, and was now accepting the arithmetic. She got out of the car. She stood on Harbor Loop for a moment with the cold off the water, finding every gap in her coat, and her father's letter in her bag, and the Bucharest assignment somewhere in a room being discussed by people she couldn't reach right now. She looked at the narrow strip of Pacific at the end of the street. It was darker now, the gray going toward charcoal as the afternoon started its compression toward evening. She walked back. Dorsey was waiting outside the post hall. She handed him the phone, hers, with the forwarded thread open. He read it in 15 seconds, and his expression went through 2 changes in that time, both controlled, both significant. Marcus, she said, we'll run it. They had the chapel register before the service ended. That's an access point you need to find, already on it. He looked at the thread again. This is substantial, Elise. I know what it is. She took the phone back. What's the status on the platforms? 2 of 3 flagged and removed. The third is offshore hosting. It's taking longer. How many views on the third? He told her the number.
It was high enough to mean the image was out in the world in a way that couldn't be fully recalled, but low enough that the specific audience who could decode what they were looking at was still limited. The image had spread mostly through military veteran communities, people who recognized the SEAL as significant, but not the program designation as specific. A photograph of
A folded document at a military memorial was interesting. It would take someone with a particular kind of knowledge to extract the operational implications. Marcus presumably already had that knowledge. "I need to talk to command," she said. "They've been waiting for your call." She went back to the overheated office and made the call on Dorsey's secure line. And it lasted 14 minutes, which was longer than she'd expected. Longer because the situation was more developed than command had initially assessed. Longer because the Bucharest assignment was not, as she'd feared, being pulled. It was being moved up 48 hours instead of 4 days, which meant she had until Wednesday morning, not Thursday. And she was standing in a veterans post hall in Creston Bay, Oregon, with her family in the next room, and a letter from her father in her bag, and approximately 36 hours to be two things at once, in a way that was going to be inadequate for both. She sat in the chair in the overheated office after the call ended, and looked at the desk and said nothing for 2 full minutes. Then she stood up and went back out to her family. She told Callum that evening, not everything, not the Bucharest piece, not Prime, not the photograph and what it meant, but the structure of it, the reserve status, the program, the nature of her work over the past 13 years. She told him in the kitchen of her mother's house, while Ruth was in the living room watching the news, and the winter dark was full against the windows, and Callum was standing at the counter with a beer he'd stopped drinking 20 minutes ago. He listened without interrupting, which was not his natural mode. It cost him something visible. She could see him stopping himself twice, the small jaw muscle working, the particular restraint of someone who has a lot of questions, and has decided correctly that questions are not what this moment needs. When she finished, he looked at his beer for a while. "You've been doing this since you were 22, he said. "Since I was 24. The first 2 years were standard. And you couldn't—" He stopped, started over. "There was no version where you could have told us. There were versions where I could have told you I was still in. I wasn't allowed to do that either. The cover had to be complete." "Why?" She looked at him. "Because partial covers fail. A family that knows you're still in service, even without details, behaves differently, asks questions in the wrong places, mentions things."
The gap between knowing and not knowing isn't protective. It's a liability. He absorbed that with the expression of someone integrating information that restructures a large portion of their history simultaneously. "Mom called you a quitter at Dad's retirement ceremony," he said, in front of his whole unit. "I remember. You didn't say anything. I couldn't. And I laughed." He set the beer down. "I laughed at what she said." She looked at her brother in the kitchen light, with his good suit jacket hanging over the chair behind him, and his face doing the work of reckoning. He looked young in a way she hadn't seen since they were children. Not naive, not innocent, just not yet finished becoming what he was going to be. "You didn't know," she said. "That's not the same as it being okay." "No," she agreed. "It's not." They stood in the kitchen, and the silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was more than they'd managed in years. "I want to fix it," he said. "I know. I don't know how. You'll figure it out." She picked up her own coffee, which was at least warm this time. "You're good at assembling things." He looked at her sideways, and she looked back, and something between them shifted. Not resolved, not healed, just moved to a place where it could start being worked on. It wasn't much. It was enough for tonight. She found the second letter the next morning. She had been going through the box of her father's belongings that the hospital had sent. The practical AMs, wallet and watch, and the paperback he'd apparently been reading in his final weeks. She went through it methodically, the way she went through everything, because she had learned that the important things were usually in the places you checked last. It was in the front pocket of the paperback, a folded piece of paper smaller than the letter from Dorsey, the handwriting the same but lighter. Written later, she thought, when his hands were already losing their pressure. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to Callum. She sat on the edge of the guest room bed and looked at it for a moment. It was sealed, a piece of tape across the fold, the kind of seal that was more intention than security. Her name was not on it. She had no right to it. She put it on the bedside table and went to finish her coffee. 20 minutes later, she knocked on the door of the room where Callum was. Staying. He took the letter from her without speaking. He looked at the tape, at the handwriting of his name. "When did you find it?" he said. This morning. He turned it over in his hands. Did you know? He looked at her. Thank you, he said. She left him alone with it. She never asked him what it said. He never told her. But 40 minutes later, she heard him in the kitchen making coffee. And when she came down, he was standing at the window looking at the harbor, with his jaw set and his eyes clear, the way someone looks after they finished something that needed finishing. And he turned and said, I'm going to take Mom to her appointment tomorrow, and next month, and after that. It was not addressed to Elise. It was addressed to nobody and everybody. The statement of a man reorganizing his obligations. She understood it the way she understood most of what her family communicated obliquely, functionally, in the language of action rather than declaration. Good, she said. He poured 2 cups and handed her one. She was packed by noon. Her flight out of Portland was early Wednesday. She had 12 hours. She sat with her mother in the living room after lunch, the television off for once, just the sound of the harbor 2 blocks away and the occasional car on Harbor Loop. You're leaving tomorrow, Ruth said. Early Wednesday. Where? Elise looked at her. Somewhere I can't say. Ruth nodded. She'd been doing that since yesterday, nodding at things she used to push back against, as if the day had rearranged something in her fundamental posture. Will it be dangerous? It's medical work, Mom. That's not what I asked. Elise held her mother's gaze. Sometimes, she said. Ruth looked at her hands in her lap. I used to introduce you as the one who didn't make it, she said quietly. I used to say it and believe it. I used to believe it was your fault somehow, that you'd taken something your father and I had given you and… She stopped. I made you smaller in my head because it was easier than missing you. The words landed in the room and stayed there. I know, Elise said. That's going to take me a while to sort out. Take your time. Ruth looked up. Her eyes were dry. She'd used up the available tears yesterday, and what remained was the clear-eyed aftermath of grief, which was in some ways harder than the grief itself, because it required you to look at things without the blur. Are you going to be all
Right? She said. Elise thought about the photograph in Pryan and Marcus in Portland, and the Bucharest assignment moved up to Wednesday, and the 36-hour window she was currently inside. She thought about the document that Command had confirmed was already being used to trace backwards through the firm's network, that Pryn's thread had opened a door that was going to take a long time to fully close, and that Gerald Pryn himself had spent the previous evening making a voluntary recorded statement to Dorsey that had added several significant pieces to the picture. She thought about her father's letter in her bag. I'm going to be all right, she said. It was true in the way that most things she said were true, precisely within defined parameters, without guaranteeing the shape of the path. Ruth reached over and took her hand. They sat like that while the afternoon moved over Creston Bay at its ordinary pace, indifferent as always to everything happening beneath it. Dorsey found her at 4. She was in the parking lot behind the house doing the last reorganization of her bag, traveling light, the way her work required. Nothing that couldn't be explained as civilian medical equipment if it needed to be. Dorsey came around the corner with his hands in his coat pockets and his face carrying the particular expression of someone who has new information and is still deciding how to frame it. Marcus, she said before he could start. We found him. He stopped. 2 feet away. His name is not Marcus. His name is Warren Addis. 41. Former signals intelligence analyst. Separated from service 4 years ago under circumstances that are now under review. Portland? He was in Portland? He moved. Dorsey paused. We think he moved in the last 6 hours. Cell tower data puts him in Salem at 2 this afternoon. That's 2 hours south of here, she said. Yes, she looked at him. He's not heading to Portland. No. She calculated Salem to Creston Bay on Highway 1 in winter traffic. 2.5 hours, maybe 3. If he'd left Salem at 2, he could be in Creston Bay by 5. It was now 4:15. Why? She said. He has the photograph. He has the program designation. What does he gain by coming here? Dorsey's jaw was tight. We think the photograph wasn't the goal. We think the photograph was confirmation. What he actually wants is… He stopped. She looked at him steadily. Is you, he said. Not physically, not a grab, but a meeting, a direct approach.
We found a draft message on a device linked to his network. It was addressed to you by name. It said, he pulled out his phone, read from it. I know what you're building in the Eastern Corridor. I know the medical cover. I have a business proposition that would be better for everyone than the alternative. She stood with that for a
moment. Business proposition. The language of someone who had decided that the information they had was leverage, and that leverage had a market price, and that the best way to find the price was to present it directly to the person most motivated to pay it. He's coming to negotiate, she said. That's what we think. With me specifically? Yes. She looked at the space between them. The parking lot was quiet.
the harbor audible 2 blocks away. The ordinary small-town afternoon doing its ordinary things. Her bag was packed. She had 12 hours. Warren Addis was on Highway 1 heading north, and he had information she needed contained, and he believed that she was the correct person to negotiate its containment. She was in fact the correct person. That was the problem. "You can intercept him before he gets here," she said. "We can," Dorsey said. "That's the option Command prefers." "And the option Command doesn't prefer." Dorsey looked at her with the expression of a man who knows the answer to a question and would prefer not to confirm it. "That you let him arrive. That you hear what he says he has. Because if he's been inside the network long enough to know about the Eastern Corridor, then there's more than one Marcus," she said. Dorsey said nothing. She stood in the parking lot behind her mother's house in Creston Bay, Oregon, with her father 2 days in the ground, and her bag packed for a Wednesday flight, and an asset compromise that was either a contained problem or the visible edge of something much larger. And she understood with complete clarity that the question she was being asked to answer in the next 45 minutes was not about Gerald Prime or a photograph or a funeral at all. It was about how far into the Eastern Corridor the breach actually went, and the only way to find out was to let Warren Addis walk into Creston Bay and tell her. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. No area code she recognized. 4 words. "I'm already in town." She showed Dorsey the screen. He read it and pulled out his own phone immediately, already moving toward the corner of the house to make the call. She let him go. She stood in the parking lot and looked at the 4 words on the screen and did the calculation she had been doing since Dorsey said the name Warren Addis, weighing what she knew against what she
Didn't. The risk of engagement against the risk of avoidance. The short-term control of an intercept against the longer intelligence value of a conversation. The math kept coming out the same way. She typed back, "Harbor Grill, 10 minutes." The Harbor Grill was a diner on the waterfront end of Harbor Loop. Booths along the windows, counter seating, a kitchen that had been producing the same clam chowder for 30 years. She knew it because her father had taken her there after school when she was 12, and she'd ordered the chowder and burned her tongue on it, and he told her that was what happened when you were impatient, and she'd thought about that sentence an unreasonable number of times since. It was public. It had 2 exits. The kitchen entrance in the back opened onto a service alley that connected to the main street. She could see the parking lot from the corner booth. All of this was relevant. None of it was why she'd chosen it. She'd chosen it because it was her town, not his. Whatever was about to happen was going to happen on ground she understood. She told Dorsey where she was going. He told her he would have 2 people positioned outside and that he was strongly recommending against this. She listened to the recommendation, acknowledged it, and walked to the Harbor Grill. See, Warren Addis was already inside. He was in a booth along the far wall, not the corner she'd have chosen, which told her he'd arrived and selected quickly, without the kind of tactical reading of a room that genuine field training produced. He was 41, but looked younger in the face and older in the eyes, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and the particular power of someone who spent a lot of time in front of screens in bad lighting. He was wearing a jacket that was good quality but wrong for the weather, the kind of clothing choice that said he'd packed in a hurry or for a different climate. He had a coffee in front of him that he wasn't drinking. He saw her come in, and his expression did the thing she'd expected, a rapid recalibration. The face of someone who had constructed a scenario in their head and was now meeting the actual person it had featured and finding the actual person different from the construction. She was used to that. She was always different from people's construction of her. She sat down across from him. A waitress appeared and Elise ordered
coffee she didn't need, and the waitress left, and the diner did its ordinary business around them. An older couple by the window, a man at the counter reading something on his phone, the low sound of a radio from the kitchen. Addis looked at her for a moment. "You came alone," he said. "I came without visible company," she said. "There's a difference." He absorbed that. He had the look of a man who had prepared extensively for a conversation and was realizing that the preparation had been based on a model of the other person that didn't quite fit. "I expected someone older," he said. "People usually do." He put both hands on the table. The gesture was deliberate. "Look, no threat. I want to talk." And she read it as genuine, which was the more dangerous version of the 2 options. A man who wanted to talk had convinced himself the talking was reasonable. That was a harder position to move than hostility. "You know what I have," he said. "I know what you think you have." A small shift in his expression. "I've been tracking your program's footprint in the Eastern Corridor for 14 months. I have documented contact points in 3 cities. I have signals intercepts that place your assets in those locations during specific operational windows. I have—" Stop. She kept her voice level.
I'm not going to sit here and let you inventory things at me like it's a negotiation. If it were a negotiation, you'd have contacted me through a channel that suggested you understood what you were dealing with. You didn't. You sent a photograph of a document at a funeral and then drove south on a Tuesday afternoon. She picked up her coffee. That's not the behavior of someone who has leverage. That's the behavior of someone who has information they don't fully understand and is trying to find out what it's worth before someone takes it from them. The silence that followed had weight. Addis looked at the table. He looked at his untouched coffee. He looked at the window, at the gray waterfront outside, at something that wasn't in the room. I'm not trying to sell anything to a foreign actor, he said. I want you to know that. Then what do you want? He looked back at her. And this was the moment she'd been waiting for, the moment that told her what kind of problem this actually was, because the "what do you want" question always answered it. People who wanted money said things arranged around money.
People who wanted status said things arranged around recognition. People who were scared said things arranged around fear. Warren Addis said, I want to know if the program is doing what I think it's doing in those cities, and if it is, I want someone to tell me it's being done correctly. She looked at him. I was signals intelligence for 11 years. He said, I was good at it, and when I left, when I was separated, I had reasons for leaving that I was told to keep quiet about, concerns about a specific operation, an operation in the Eastern European medical corridor that I believed was being used for a secondary purpose that nobody above me wanted to hear about. He stopped. I've spent 4 years trying to find out if I was right, and 14 months ago, I found a thread that led me to your program. The diner was doing its ordinary business. The couple by the window was finishing their meal. The man at the counter had switched from his phone to a newspaper. You think there's a secondary operation running alongside the program? She said, I think there was. I don't know if it's current. His hands were still on the table, still visible. I don't know if the people running your program know about it. That's what I'm trying to find out. She sat with that for a long moment. 14 months of tracking. A signals analyst separated under contested circumstances. Concerns raised and suppressed. A thread followed until it led to her name on a document at a funeral. This was not the architecture of a man trying to sell something. This was the architecture of a man who had been carrying something alone for a long time and had finally found a door that might be attached to the right room. It didn't make him safe. It didn't make the photograph acceptable, but it changed the shape of the conversation substantially. The firm you've been working with, she said. Marcus, how much does he know? He knows I was tracking the corridor. He doesn't know what I found. I kept the specific analysis separate. I needed it as insurance. A pause. Insurance against him. Actually, I realized 6 weeks ago that the firm wasn't what he said it was. I've been trying to figure out how to get out of it without losing the information I'd already gathered. And then my name appeared on a register. And then your name appeared on a register. He confirmed. She looked at him. The flat afternoon light through the diner window was doing unkind things to both of them. She probably looked as tired as
She felt. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in months, which she suspected was accurate. The photograph was stupid, she said. I know the platforms. I know it was reactive. Marcus was pushing me for something concrete, and I moved before I thought. He met her eyes. I'm not going to pretend that was anything other than what it was. No, she said, you're not. She put both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the window and made the decision that she'd actually already made in the parking lot, the one she'd been walking toward since Dorsey showed her the draft message. It was not the safe decision. It was the correct one. You're going to give me everything, she said, every piece of the analysis, every contact point, every signals intercept, every documented location. You're going to give it to me tonight, here, before I leave Creston Bay. He looked at her steadily. And in return, if what you have is what you say it is, the people who separated you are going to have a problem that is significantly larger than your separation was, and you're going to have documentation of the concerns you raised that were suppressed. She paused. That's not immunity. That's not a deal. That's what happens when accurate information goes to the right place. You can guarantee that. I can guarantee that I'll put it in front of people who have the authority to act on it. What they do is not my guarantee to make. She picked up her coffee. I'm not going to promise you something I don't control. If someone did, they were lying to you. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a fishing boat was moving along the harbor, slow and purposeful in the gray water. Prime, he said. What happens to him? He's already making his statement. What happens after that depends on what his statement contains and what the review finds. She looked at him. Why? He didn't know what he was involved in.
Not really. I know that's a factor. Addis nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee for the first time, drank some of it, set it down. My car's on the street 2 blocks north, he said. I have a laptop. The full analysis is encrypted on a local drive. I didn't put it in any cloud storage. I kept it physically with me for the last 3 months. I'll need the decryption. You'll get it. They sat in the harbor grill for another 10 minutes while she sent a coded message to command and got a response that was 2 words long, both of which meant proceed.
And then she left the diner first, and Dorsey met her on the sidewalk, and she gave him the short version and watched his face run through its controlled range of responses. Command wants to verify directly, he said. They're going to. She started walking north on Harbor Loop. Have SEALs meet us at the car. The analysis took 3 hours to transfer, verify, and transmit to command through the secure channel Dorsey established from the back of a rental SUV parked 2 blocks from the harbor grill. OTI sat on the front seat and provided decryptions and answered questions in the flat, precise language of someone who had spent 11 years organizing signals data into narratives. And the narrative he had organized was, as command confirmed in a message that arrived at 7:43, significant. There had been a secondary operation, not current. It had been shut down 18 months ago, quietly, without public acknowledgement, but it had run alongside the program's Eastern Corridor work for 3 years, using the medical infrastructure as a concealment layer for a separate intelligence-gathering operation that had not been disclosed to the program's own medical officers. The people who ran it had made a decision that the concealment was acceptable, and the medical officers didn't need to know. Otis had identified it from signal anomalies that didn't fit the official operational picture and had raised the concern through his chain of command and been told in the language of career management to let it go. He hadn't let it go, and 4 years later he was in a rental car in Creston Bay explaining himself to the person who might finally be in a position to do something about it. At 8:15, command confirmed they were opening a formal review. At 8:30, they confirmed that 2 of the people who had managed Addis's separation were already known to the review committee for separate reasons, and that his documentation would be material evidence. At 8:47, a message came through that Elise read twice. Cooperative witness status confirmed, pending review completion. Prime review underway. Military contractor firm flagged for federal investigation. Marcus/Addis network. 3 additional connected devices identified. Platform image fully removed. Navarro Bucharest timeline confirmed, Wednesday 0600. Report in person upon return. She showed Addis the relevant line. He read it without expression. Then he said, "That's
More than I expected. You gave them something real." She said, "That's what happens." He looked at his hands. 4 years, he said, not quite to her. 4 years carrying that. She understood what that felt like. She didn't say so, because they didn't have the kind of relationship that required her to say so, but she understood it in the specific way of someone who knew what it cost to carry a true thing alone for a long time in a world that wasn't ready to hear it. "Go home," she said. "Not to Portland. Go somewhere that isn't on the itinerary you gave the firm. Dorsey will give you a contact number for the review committee. When they call, answer." He got out of the car. She watched him walk north on Harbor Loop until he turned the corner, and then she sat in the back of the SUV with Dorsey in the front seat and the secured laptop between them and the gray Oregon night pressing against the windows. "Wednesday at 6, Dorsey said. "I know you have 9 hours. I know that too." She got out of the car. Died. The house was quiet when she got back. The lights were on in the living room and the kitchen, and through the front window she could see the blue flicker of the television, and for a moment she stood on the front porch and looked at it. The ordinary domestic fact of a lit window, people inside, the light that her father had written about in his letter, and let it be what it was, without adding anything to it. Then she went inside. Ruth was on the couch watching something she wasn't really watching. Callum was in the kitchen with the remains of dinner still on the counter, reading something on his phone. They both looked up when she came in, and neither of them asked where she'd been, which was either courtesy or exhaustion or the beginning of understanding, and she chose to believe it was the beginning of understanding. "There's soup," Callum said. "I made it. It's edible." She looked at him. "You made soup? Don't make it a thing." Well, she got a bowl, and it was in fact edible, a vegetable situation with too-much garlic that her father would have approved of. And she sat at the kitchen table and ate it while Callum put the dishes away with his back to her, which was how he'd always handled the moments when he had something to say that he wasn't sure how to say. "I read Dad's letter," he said to the dish rack. "Okay. He was harder on me than I expected." "Was he?" he said.
Callum turned around, leaned against the counter. He said, "I got comfortable with a version of the family that was convenient for me, and I stopped asking questions when the answers might have required me to change." He looked at the floor. He wasn't wrong. She ate her soup. He also said he was proud of me, Callum added, but he put that part after the hard part, which is exactly what he would do. Exactly what he would do, she agreed. Callum was quiet for a moment. I'm going to do better. I said that last night, but I want to say it again when it's not fresh, because things said when they're fresh don't always stick. I know, she said. This is not fresh, he said. This is me having slept on it and having eaten soup I made myself and still meaning it. She looked at her brother. He was not a changed man. Change didn't happen in 2 days, and she would have believed it less if he'd presented it that way. He was the same person he'd been yesterday, just standing slightly differently relative to the things he knew. That was all change ever was at the beginning, the standing differently. The rest came from keeping that position long enough for it to become the new default. I'm leaving at 4:30, she said. He nodded. I'll be up. You don't have to. I'll be up, he said again. She finished the soup. She sat with her mother for an hour before bed. They didn't talk much. Ruth had the television on low, and they sat on the couch the way they'd sat when Elise was a teenager, homesick from school, side by side, not quite touching, the shared proximity enough without requiring anything additional from it. Her mother smelled like the same soap she'd used for 30 years, and the lamp beside her made the lines of her face look softer than the afternoon light had. And Elise sat next to her and thought about all the versions of this room she'd carried with her across 13 years and 7 time zones and a number of locations she'd never been able to name to anyone. I'm going to call more, Elise said at one point. Ruth said, I know you can. Always. When I can. When you can, Ruth agreed. Later, Ruth said, Your father used to say that the hardest thing about loving soldiers was that you had to learn to love them at a distance. She smoothed the fabric of the couch arm with one hand. I was never very good at that part. He knew that, Elise said. I know he knew.
Ruth looked at the television, which was showing something neither of them were watching. I think he loved me for it anyway, that I was bad at the distance. He said once that it meant he was worth missing. The room was very quiet. You're worth missing, Elise said. Ruth pressed her lips together. Don't make me cry again, she said. I've cried more this week than I have in 20 years. I'm dehydrated. Elise laughed. A real one, short and genuine, the kind that came from somewhere below the controlled surface, and her mother heard it and turned and looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, and was something that lived in the complicated territory between them, the territory they'd never had a clean map for, but were apparently still navigating. Ruth put her hand on her daughter's face, just briefly, a gesture her mother had used when she was small and that she hadn't used since, and Elise sat still and let her. Go sleep, Ruth said. You have a long day tomorrow. She did. Man, she didn't sleep. She lay in the guest room in the dark and ran the analysis again. Not of 80s, not of the breach, not of the Eastern Corridor. She ran the analysis of the week. The drive from Portland in the ice, the chapel, Hartwell's hand on her wrist, the 7th row, the folder, the letter, prying in the rental car, Addison in the diner, the soup with too much garlic, her mother's hand on her face. She had spent 13 years becoming very good at not needing the things she was allowed to feel tonight. That was not actually a skill. She had been calling it a skill for a long time, because it was easier to call it a skill than to call it what it was, a coping mechanism that worked well enough in the field and cost something she didn't always have a name for in the gaps between. 13 years of missing her father's retirement, her mother's birthday 3 years running, Callum's wedding, the one that hadn't lasted, the one she'd sent a gift for from a city she couldn't name. Small absences, individually justified, collectively accumulating into a shape she was only now starting to see clearly. It was worth it. She believed that the work she did, the people she'd helped in places that didn't appear on public maps, the 18 months of secondary operation uncovered tonight because Addis had kept asking, and she had been the right door. It was worth it. That wasn't in question, but worth it, and without cost, were not the same calculation, and she had been running the wrong equation for a long time. She lay in the dark and let herself know that. Then she got up at 3:15 and made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with her father's letter and read it a third time. You carried more than we knew, and you carried it with honor. She folded it along its creases and put it in the inner pocket of her back against the side closest to her body, where she kept things she needed to keep. Callum was at
the kitchen at 4. He looked terrible, unshaven, barely awake, a mug in his hand that was doing most of the structural work. She looked at him and felt something that was not quite affection and not quite exasperation, and was probably the exact emotion that siblings were invented to produce. "You look like the soup disagreed with you," she said. "The soup was fine. I'm just not a 4 a.m. person." "Then go back to bed." I said I'd be up. He poured her a coffee without asking. "So I'm up." They stood in the kitchen in the pre-dawn dark and drank their coffee and didn't manufacture conversation, which was the most honest thing they'd done together in years. The harbor was invisible outside the window, but audible, the low sounds of water doing its long, patient work against the coast. At 4:25, she picked up her bag. Callum walked her to the door. On the porch, in the cold, he put his arms around her in the clumsy, determined way of someone who had decided to do a thing and was going to do it correctly, regardless of how it felt. She let him. She put her arm around his back and felt the solid weight of her brother, the same person who had laughed at the wrong moments and filled silences with the wrong stories, and who was underneath all of that still the person who had taught her to ride a bike on the street when she was 6, and who was standing in the cold at 4:30 in the morning because he'd said he would be. "Be careful," he said. "Always." "That's not actually true," he said, "but say it anyway." She pulled back and looked at him. "Be good to Mom," she said, "and get some sleep." In that order. In that order. She walked down the porch steps to her car. The porch light was on behind her. She didn't look back, not because she was being stoic, but because she knew the image was already in her. The lit window, the cold air, her brother in the doorway. And looking back wouldn't add anything to it. It was already something she'd carry. She drove to Portland in the dark. The formal review opened on the Thursday after she left. She knew this because Dorsey sent her a single line through the secure channel 2 days into the Bucharest assignment. Review open. 6 principals named, all stateside. She sent back 2 words and moved on to the work she was there to do, which was what she always did. Filed the information in the place where she kept things she couldn't have
On in the moment and returned to the thing in front of her. She heard the rest in pieces over the following weeks through channels that were always slightly delayed and never complete. Gerald Prime's voluntary statement, combined with the metadata trace and the content of Addis's analysis, opened an investigation into the military contractor firm that had employed them both. The firm's primary client network was flagged within 10 days. Marcus Warren Addis's contact was identified as a man named Carl Vesey, former logistics officer, operating under a consulting license that turned out to cover a structure built specifically to collect and broker intelligence from retired and separated military personnel. Vesey was arrested in Portland on a Thursday. The arrest was not public. The consequences were 3. Of the 6 principals named in the review were from the generation of officers who had managed the secondary operation in the Eastern Corridor. 2 of them were retired. 1 was still active duty, in a position of administrative authority over program funding. All 3 were placed on administrative review within 30 days of the investigation opening. None of their names appeared in any press release because that wasn't how these things worked. And Elise had long since made her peace with the fact that the justice that happened in her world was usually invisible to the world it protected. Hartwell submitted a formal written statement to the review committee that included unprompted a description of his conduct at the memorial and an acknowledgement of the harm it had caused. The committee noted it. The committee also noted that his phone call to the base commander, the call that had identified Elise and triggered the change in the chapel, had been the action that surfaced the situation and ultimately set the events of that day in motion. In the particular accounting of these things, those 2 facts existed side by side. The man who had humiliated her had also inadvertently been the mechanism of her recognition. She found that complicated and eventually filed it under true things that don't resolve cleanly, which was a category she maintained for a reason. Addis completed his formal testimony over 3 days in a room in Washington. She never heard directly what he said, but the outcome of the review contained a line sanitized, stripped of specifics, present in the summary she received through channels that read, "Concerns regarding secondary operational disclosure."
Practices had been substantiated and referred for structural review. That was the language that meant someone had been right for 4 years, and the right people had finally said so in writing. It was not a public vindication. It never would be. But it was the kind of true that stayed true. The kind that went into documents that people who needed to know would read. Prime's review concluded 6 weeks after the funeral. His involvement was assessed as non-knowing. He had been a vector, not an actor, used by Vesey's network in the way that experienced operators used people like Prime, exploiting loyalty and financial need, and the particular vulnerability of men who had given a career to something and been placed outside it without adequate transition. His contractor license was suspended. His access to specific networks was revoked. He would live with the knowledge of what he'd been part of, which Elise suspected was a harder consequence than the formal ones.
She didn't feel satisfaction about that. She felt something more neutral and more honest. The recognition that the system, imperfect and slow and partial as it was, had done something approximating what it was supposed to do. And that was a thing worth noting, even when it came too late and landed too softly. She came back to Creston Bay in March, not for any official reason. She had a 10-day window between assignments, the kind of gap that happened 3 or 4 times a year, and that she had historically used to go somewhere that wasn't home, because going home required a kind of sustained presence she found harder than fieldwork. This time she drove north on Highway 1 in the gray March light, and parked in front of her mother's house and sat in the car for approximately 90 seconds before going in. Ruth opened the door before she knocked. "I saw the car," she said. "Stalking me through the window," Elise said. "Absolutely," Ruth said, and held the door open. The house smelled like coffee and whatever Ruth had been cooking, and the porch light was off because it was afternoon, and everything was ordinary in the specific way that Elise had been teaching herself to receive without irony. The ordinary as the thing, not the absence of the extraordinary. Callum came down from Portland that weekend. He brought a woman he'd been seeing for 2 months and introduced her to Elise in the kitchen, with the nervous energy of someone who had to type.
Compartmentalization was no longer his preferred mode of operating, which Elise found quietly encouraging. The woman's name was Adaz, and she was a civil engineer, and she talked to Ruth for 40 minutes about the harbor seawall project, and by the end of the afternoon, Ruth had decided she was excellent, which was Ruth's equivalent of a formal endorsement. Elise sat on the back porch that evening while the others were inside and watched the last light leave the sky over the Pacific and thought about what Stu Fogott had said. He carried it every single day. Her father carrying a pride he couldn't name, in a direction he couldn't indicate, for a daughter he wasn't supposed to know anything about. 13 years of that. She had spent 13 years carrying the weight of the silence, and he had spent the same 13 years carrying a different weight, the weight of knowing without being allowed to say, and neither of them had known the other was carrying it. That was the part she'd been working on since January. Not the injustice of the chapel, not Hartwell's assumption, not the years of her family's dismissal. Those were real, but they were in the end the surface of it. The deeper thing was the distance that the silence had required, and the cost of that distance on both sides, and the fact that the distance had not been meaningless. The work she did with it was real, was necessary, had mattered. But that necessary didn't automatically mean without cost, and she had been confusing those two things for a long time. She was 31 years old. She had a long career ahead of her in places she couldn't name, doing work that would never be publicly acknowledged. She was going to continue doing it. She was not going to stop being the person who pulled people out of places they couldn't get out of alone, who carried genetical knowledge to the places the medical infrastructure didn't reach, who understood that the work of keeping people alive was sometimes the only work that mattered, regardless of what surrounded it. But she was going to do it differently, not softer. She had no interest in softer, and her CEO would have something to say about softer, and the work didn't accommodate softer. Differently. Meaning she was going to call her mother when she could. She was going to answer Callan's texts instead of letting them accumulate into guilt. She was going to let the people who were worth something to her know that they were in the ways available to her, because she had watched her father fail to do that and had watched the cost of that failure land on the people he loved, and she was not going to replicate it. Small adjustments, not transformation. The kind of change that happens incrementally in the margins, where the pressure of a life gradually reshapes the container it lives in. She was going to try. Oh, on the last night of the 10 days, she sat with her mother at the kitchen table after dinner, while Callum and Adsy did the dishes with the competitive goodwill of people trying to make a good impression, and Ruth poured 2 cups of tea that nobody had asked for and slid one across the table to Elise in the wordless way of someone who had decided that this was what was happening. "I introduced you to Doris yesterday," Ruth said. Doris was the neighbor who had been at the memorial. "I know she remembered me from the chapel." "I introduced you differently than I used to," Ruth said. Elise wrapped her hands around the cup. "How did you introduce me?" Ruth looked at her across the table with the directness that she had always been capable of and had only occasionally chosen to use. "I said, 'This is my daughter, Elise. She's a medical officer, and she serves this country in ways I'm only beginning to understand, and I am very proud of her.'" The kitchen was warm and smelled like dish soap and tea, and somewhere in the background Callum and Adsy were having a quiet argument about the correct method for stacking a dish rack, which was such a specific ordinary sound that it took Elise a moment to locate herself in it. "Mom," she said. "I know it's late," Ruth said. "I'm saying it anyway." Elise looked at her mother, at the lines of her face, the careful posture, the woman who had gotten things wrong in specific and documented ways, and was not asking for those ways to be forgotten, that was doing the harder work of getting things right from here forward, which was the only direction available and the only direction that counted. "Thank you," Elise said. Ruth lifted her cup. "Drink your tea," she said. "It's good tea."
It was not particularly good tea. Elise drank it anyway. She left on a Tuesday morning before anyone was up. She left a note on the kitchen table, not a long one. She was
not a long note person, and her family had learned to read the length of her notes the way they read her other communications, for what was there and what was deliberately absent. The note said, "Back in the fall, if I can manage it. Call me when something happens, good or bad. I mean that. E." She put her bag in the car and drove south on Highway 1 as the sun was just beginning its argument with the horizon, the Pacific to her right, going from black to charcoal to the particular dark blue that arrived before the gray. And she let herself have the drive the way she had learned to have things she loved, fully, without managing the feeling of it, without cataloging it against the future. The work was waiting. It was always waiting. A debrief in Washington, a new assignment being shaped in a room she hadn't seen yet, a corridor in Eastern Europe that was cleaner than it had been 3 months ago, but not clean enough. The endless, ongoing effort of keeping things intact that wanted to fall apart. She was good at that work. She was going to keep being good at it. But she was also a daughter who had left a note on a table, a sister who had sat in a kitchen at 4 a.m, a woman who carried a letter in her inner pocket, and who had learned slowly and late, and at considerable cost, that strength was not the same thing as the absence of need. The strongest people she had ever known, in field hospitals, in forward operating conditions, in the particular extremity of situations that don't make it into any official record, had not been people without need. They had been people who knew what they needed and carried it with them, tended it quietly, kept it alive through whatever they were moving through. They had been people who understood that vulnerability was not a liability to be eliminated, but a reality to be managed with the same discipline and precision applied to everything else. She had been learning that for 31 years. She was still learning it. The highway curved along the coast, and the sun came over the ridge and hit the water, and the Pacific went from dark blue to silver all at once, the way it did on clear mornings. And she drove through that light with her father's letter against her ribs, and her mother's voice in her memory, and the work ahead of her that she would never fully be done with. She did not need anyone to tell her she had done well. She knew what she had done. She drove.